From Classrooms to Careers is presented by the Spring Branch ISD Alumni Foundation. This series is made possible through the generous support of First Community Credit Union.
Well, welcome to Six Schools, One Legacy, From Classrooms to Careers, where we highlight the stories of exceptional graduates from the 6 high schools of the Spring Branch Independent School District. Each conversation explores the path from student life to professional life, the lessons, the challenges, and the moments that shape the journey. I'm Paul Marks, a 1976 graduate of Memorial High School in the Spring Branch School District, and I'm your host. And today I'm excited to be joined by Robert Draper, a 1976 graduate of Westchester High School. Welcome, Robert.
That's right, Paul.
So let's start out, talk a little bit about where you grew up and where you entered into the Spring Branch School District.
Sure. I come from a family of Texans. I was born and raised in Houston in the Meyerland area. When I was in, I believe, the middle of first grade, my father transferred to St. Louis. We lived there for about 4.5 years, and returned to Houston and to the Spring Branch Independent School District in, I want to say, like 1970. And so I uh, finished out junior high school in the district, then attended Westchester High and graduated in 1976, as you mentioned.
So when you got to the Spring Branch District, coming back from St. Louis, I think you said you went to Spring Forest Junior High and then to Memorial Junior High. Do you have any memories of any teachers or anything that stuck out in those junior high years when you were at those 2 schools?
Very much so, and particularly at Memorial, where I spent most of my time. At Spring Forest, you know, your the audience should know that I mean, the district was still a very young district, and Spring Forest was at the western flank of that district, and to the west of, let's say, extending just beyond where Stratford High School is located, there wasn't much there. And the people who were going to Spring Forest were of a decidedly working class background, where Memorial was much more established. And I think we'll get into this when we get into high school. But this was the end of the 60s and into the 70s, which was a culturally turbulent period.
Right.
Uh, at Memorial, I remember very well um, a couple of English teachers, particularly Loma Hobson, who taught 7th grade English, and Marjorie Weaver, who taught 8th grade. Both of them were very, very encouraging to me. At that point, I had known for years that I wanted to be a writer. I wasn't quite sure how one went about doing that, and it also is not the way schools weren't geared to. They you could be in a science club, you could be in a language club, you could be in a speech or drama club, you could certainly be in athletics, but promoting writing was not anything that schools of most kinds sort of were set up to do. And so it was really an important thing for me to have the encouragement of teachers, particularly Ms. Hobson, who not just encouraged me to write, but would have me read in front of the class what I wrote, and would at times even encourage me to basically build out a play from what I wrote and have people in the class act out characters in those plays. So yeah, those were really formative and inspirational for me.
I didn't ask you before, but specifically, where did you live when you moved back from St. Louis?
Yeah, I lived in the subdivision called Rustling Pines. Is uh, the the major street. Basically, if you know where what we called West Belden is now
Yes.
Beltway 8, um, uh, off of that is Wilchester, and I lived basically on Wilchester and a cul-de-sac, Apple Tree Road.
Okay.
And at that time, that cul-de-sac had, I think, 5 houses on it. Now it has 8. Pretty much all of the houses that were on it when I showed up had been torn down and replaced with McMansions, including
Yes,
including our former house. But that's
exactly.
where we.
So after you left Memorial Junior High, it was time to go to high school. You went to Westchester. Talk a little bit about that transition.
It was a, it was an exciting one for me, but also it's always, I think it's always hard to start in one's adolescence as a freshman, at the very bottom of the totem pole. And as I mentioned before, this was a period of cultural transition in America, and the Vietnam War was still going on. There was a there were a lot of drugs in the area, and parents preoccupied with their own, you know, activities, nonetheless were concerned about raising kids in this atmosphere, and so it fell in a lot of ways to the administration of Westchester and the other high schools, presumably, to kind of keep the kids in line. Kids, boys wore their hair long frequently back then, and that there was a hair code in addition to a dress code that was enforced. And this is an oddity of the period that would, I think, properly strike most people as bizarre today. But for boys who elected to continue to wear their hair long, the district, I, I don't know if this was a legal matter, whether they felt like constrained from actually enforcing hair code, but would make the kids wear wigs. And so you'd see all these boys wearing like, some granny wig that was ill-fitting and not very convincing, that just basically was there to cover up their, ponytail.
Yeah.
And the girls had many skirts, and the length of their skirts was also a subject of great concern. And so that was kind of the overall atmosphere. It was a big school and so big, um, Westchester was, that midway into uh, my tenure there, the school split off into a second school, Stratford, and because we, every class was filled to capacity. We had, or were known as T shacks, temporary shacks, um, that were basically spillover temporary buildings where classes were held. And there were more kids than the district literally knew what to do with. And this was a function of the fact that, um, again, culturally speaking, in the wake of student protests, riots, and things like that, there was a lot of urban flight throughout America, certainly including Houston, and a flight out into the suburbs. And so the suburbs were in great demand, Spring Branch in very, very high demand, which created drains on the school system and led to these temporary shacks and all. So it was in many ways an exciting time insofar as the district was growing rapidly, tumultuous time in the way that growth always can be, and with all the cultural spasms that I just mentioned as well.
We graduated the same year from different schools, but that policy with the boys wearing the wigs was there, and I've never understood it because it drew more attention to them than, if they were just had their natural hair out there. So it kind of didn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I had friends who wore their wigs. I was, I kept my hair kind of right on the border. Didn't want to draw attention to myself and wear something as goofy as a wig. But for them, it was, this was a thing also. Adolescents generally, they they may harbor within them a rebellious streak, and when the culture, or in this case, the counterculture, kind of promotes that notion, then it can manifest itself in different ways. We didn't really know what we were protesting against, but when the administration was there, basically saying you can't have long hair, well, that sounded like something to rebel against, and so that's how kids responded to it early.
So um, you got to Westchester, all that you just talked about was absolutely going on in the world. Talk a little bit about some of the things that you remember about Westchester from the standpoint of either the teachers, principals. Any classes or organizations that you were involved with, your interest within school that kind of was the foundation of what you ended up doing in your career?
Yeah, the one pronounced thing about Westchester was that it was um, the default for uh, getting kids involved was to get them involved in athletics or in support roles of athletics, meaning the band, cheerleaders, marching groups, etc., drill teams, and that was in keeping also with the fact that a number of the people in the administration had a coaching background. And my first year that I was there, my freshman year, we had Westchester had a very famous baseball pitcher. David Clyde was his name, and he ended up getting drafted by the Texas Rangers. He was a national phenomenon, and so he went straight out of high school and into the pros. We had a football team that, at least during my time there, was not great, but competitive, and so there was a lot of gravitational pull, as it were, towards the football team and pep rallies and the like. And after all, we are in Texas, so
Right.
um, there were uh, there were some really really fine teachers, and I think that uh, you know, I had this, like, though I was terrible in science, we had this guy, Mr. Franklin, who had a cult following because he was so good, and there were uh, teachers in drama and debate, which we'll get into in a minute, who also were distinguished, and and then because of the aforementioned, kind of population boom, there were coaches who were pressed into service, to be math teachers and shop teachers. So it was, a bit of a scramble, I think, at times to accommodate the whole population. The school itself was fairly new when I moved in. I think that it had been built in. I'm gonna that's deserves fact checking, but probably let's say 1967, something like that. So by the time I entered in 72, it was just 5 years old. It was distinct architecturally for having these arches at the front, which a lot of us snarkily liken to McDonald's. And in the way of a lot of schools back then, the classrooms tended not to have windows so as to minimize any distractions. But it was an expansive um, campus with a lot of pine trees, and it was very much built into um, the neighborhood, meaning there were a lot of kids who walked to and from school, and there were apartment complexes abutting the freeway that were right up against it, and so it was, in all meaningful ways, a neighborhood educational institution.
So, talk a little bit about. I know you mentioned you got into debate. One question that I have is, since your career took you into journalism, were you involved in journalism at all when you were in school?
Yes, that came a little bit later. I got into debate through my older brother, Eli, who in turn had been encouraged to get into debate by an older cousin of ours who went to Kincaid. And so Eli really loved debate and really pushed me to get into it too. And I think that especially for a kid in a big school like Westchester was, it's easy to get lost. It's easy to find yourself just kind of adrift without some kind of anchor. And so debate provided that for me. As I said, I've known really since I was in, I don't know, first grade that I wanted to uh, write, and did a lot of creative writing on my own as well as in classes. I didn't want to be a journalist per se because for me, um, when I thought of writing, I thought of fiction. I thought of writing novels, and in fact, senior year in high school, I began a novel which I completed in by the end of my freshman year in college, and which thankfully was never published. It was truly horrible, but like a real low grade Catcher in the Rye. But I uh, I got involved in the student newspaper El Gato my junior year, and my senior year was the assistant editor, and so second in command. My uh, activities in debate, which required a great amount of research, not to mention tournaments and travel for those tournaments, foreclosed me having a higher position than assistant editor. But I did my best to like balance those two things. And I remember my freshman year, I gave momentary thought. I liked basketball a lot and had played competitively for a while, also swimming. But I remember my showing up for the first day of freshman basketball and listening to the coach, as he paced in front of us, and he sounded kind of like a drill sergeant. And I just like, this actually doesn't sound like fun. It just, it sounds like a job, and I'm not that interested. I don't have the fire in the belly. So it was at that point that athletics kind of were in my rear view forever, except just from a spectator standpoint, and I gravitated instead towards debate and journalism.
So when you were finishing up uh, your time at Westchester, thinking about going to college, I know you ended up going to University of Texas, as many folks do in Texas. What was there any other choices you were looking at, or was that what you really wanted to do?
Texas was what I wanted not to do, just because my father had gone there, my older brother was there, and I really wanted to blaze my own trail, because I had viewed myself as kind of a campus rebel, a rebel without a cause, or arguably a rebel without a clue. I, my first choice was Berkeley, and I applied to Berkeley, and they rejected me. Uh, my I was in a graduating class of 500. I think I was number 125, so I was the bottom person of the top quarter. And though I, done well in these extracurricular things, I was a, you know, an above average student, scholastically speaking. Uh, uh, my second choice was Georgetown, and Georgetown had wanted me, and had offered me a financial aid package, but with the understanding that I joined their very vaunted debate program. And to be honest, by my senior year, I felt that I had done a little too much of that. I was more interested in exploring the opposite sex than spending my weekends in libraries. And so I turned down Georgetown, and that left University of Texas. But the UT had and has this interdisciplinary honors program called Plan Two, which uh, is um, is again multidisciplinary. There are people who do it before going to law or med school or whatever else, but its main feature is that instead of these huge classes that are run by teacher assistants, they are very small classes generally, uh, and often on very interesting subjects, presided over by uh, exemplary tenured professors. So that's where I ended up, and it was, it did have its advantages being 150 miles down the road from where we lived, and my older brother already being there, and to some extent laying the groundwork for me, and of course the fact that out of my graduating class there must have been 75, 100, at least who went to UT. So of course. Um, the University of Texas campus being as vast as it is, it's not as if you would run into the same old people all day long. So even with all of those people coming, we all, scattered off into our separate directions.
And while you were there, you went to work on the Daily Texan newspaper and started kind of that portion of college life?
I did. I mean, uh, my older brother and I did some concert reviews and other music related stuff, but I wasn't, I actually never took a single journalism course. And the writing for the Daily Texan was really just a way to be able to get into concerts free and then write about them. Um, but I was really in a way that I hadn't, I uh, there was a lot to like about high school, but as I say, it was a in the way of many high schools, a kind of jockocracy, set up, for the promotion of sports and our athletics teams. And for those of us who weren't really that into it, we could feel like we were in a lower caste and or that it was a struggle in any event to find a uh, you know a real encouragement to be yourself. Being in college was a real welcome awakening in that regard, and I loved being an adult, and adult in scare quotes because of course my parents were paying for my college education and I was, adult for me meant that I could eat an RB sandwich whenever I wanted instead of, being forced to eat spinach and to go to keg parties, when should be studying. But it was my freshman year, University of Texas was when Earl Campbell it was his senior year and he won the Heisman Trophy that year, and so we had our big man on campus, and yeah, there was, and of course, Austin is now a celebrated city, but back then it was not well known beyond the state borders, and was in a lot of ways a sort of sleepy college town. The Texas legislature was there, but it was nobody's idea of a place where you went to after school, after graduating to make money, much less to become, filthy rich, as is now
Yeah.
an entirely possible eventuality living there.
So, after college, I know you spent a good portion of your career as a magazine journalist. Take us down that path real quick.
It's upon graduating, if you want to be a writer, there is no set path, like say being a lawyer, going to law school, and then applying to, whatever kinds of law firms offer the sorts of legal channels that you're interested in pursuing. Uh, you kind of just plant your flag and say, well, world, I'm a writer. And unless you want to work for a newspaper, which I did not, I um, uh, at about the time that I had begun at Westchester, this new magazine had started up in Texas called Texas Monthly, and it was unlike anything the state had ever seen. Very irreverent, practicing long form journalism with really brilliant writers and reporters who weren't afraid to question any of the kind of myths of Texas and so that sort of reading Texas Monthly kind of put uh, a twinkle in my eye, in terms of the possibilities of being a journalist as opposed to being, say, a novelist. And I floundered after college for a few years, um, managed this really mediocre at best new wave band. I worked for this technical um, translation company that translated technical documents from all sorts of foreign languages into English, and in a middle management supply. My linguistic skills were not great, and sort of very undirected things like that until finally, through a succession of events, I got this idea to do a book about the history of Rolling Stone magazine. I managed to finagle a book contract from the New York publishing house Doubleday in 1988, and the book was published in 1990 and did quite well, enough so to like set me on the path and to get the attention of the magazine down the road, Texas Monthly, that had been up to that point rejecting every single story idea that I had sent their way. And so I became a staff writer for Texas Monthly in March of 1991 and stayed there until the middle of 97 when the New York-based magazine, GQ magazine, made me an offer I couldn't refuse. And I then went to work for them for uh, the next 10 years while continuing for the most part to live in Austin until I decided in 2007, or I'm sorry, in 2004, to write a book about my former governor, the sitting president, George W. Bush. Managed to score a succession of interviews with him in the Oval Office. And that book was a bestseller and pretty much transformed my career. And in midway in the research of that book, I relocated to Washington, where I've been ever since.
And you've also written for National Geographic and traveled the world for them, haven't you?
I did, yes, for when the Bush book was published in 2007. And as I say, the book did really well. I fielded offers from National Geographic, where I knew an editor who had actually been from Texas Monthly, as well as from the New York Times Magazine. And I signed contracts to work for both of them as an independent contractor and was paid a kind of salary to do both. And so for a period of from 2007 until 2022, I spent roughly 3 to 4 months out of the year overseas for National Geographic, and the rest of the time covering domestic politics for the Times. The Geographic gig was, as you can imagine, a really, really uh, exciting one and just a remarkable thing. I did not have the giraffes and elephants beat. They sent me to uh, high conflict zones, really troubled parts of the world, and that meant, among other places, Libya, Somalia, Afghanistan, the Congo, Madagascar after the government fell, uh, um, and Sudan, Yemen. So it's not garden spots, at least as we've come to imagine them, but in their own right, really beautiful, if tragic, and chaotic places. And I spent a month on a boat going up and down the Congo River, and that was, a such a privilege to be able to go to a place where for hundreds of miles there was no electricity, and so the skies were completely unpolluted, and we sleep on riverbanks, just pitching tent on land where I, you know some locals would live, and we'd pay them like $5 to let to use the place in areas like this in the Congo. There were people who'd never seen someone with my hair color before,
Hmm.
and certainly never seen anyone with a laptop. And
Yeah.
so there's a photo that I have of the photographer took of me typing my notes for the day, and like 30 kids surrounding me, looking as if I was holding some holy scepter or something. And so these were like really is they really informed just my view of the world. These experiences did, in a way that reporting, um, on domestic politics in Washington D.C. never could have.
And so now you're working with the New York Times?
Yes, I had written for the New York Times Magazine. I think my first story for them was in 2002, but in earnest, 2008. And um, and so those were all long, 5 to 10,000 word, possibly unreadably long magazine stories. But in the summer of 2022, when it was evident to me that National Geographic had been bought by Disney and they were starting to just shed workers, lots of layoffs, felt I could see the train coming down the track and didn't want to be hit by it. So I um, entered into talks with the New York Times, who created a job for me, in essence, buying up all of my business. And so in January of 2023, I began working full time for them, splitting my time between doing front page stories for the Washington, D.C. Bureau and doing magazine stories as before. I've kind of done it backwards. I think I started, I became gainfully employed by the New York Times at the age of 65 when most people are thinking of winding down their careers, and covering, probably the most turbulent time, in American politics since the Civil War. So it certainly keeps my heart rate going in my mid 60s.
Yes. Well, before we finish up the interview, I wanted to ask you to, if there was a current student within the Spring Branch School District who was watching this interview, what type of advice can you give them about finishing up their years within the school they're in the district, as well as how to plan for their future and how to get on their journey?
Sure. I'm an unusual case in that I knew, from childhood what it was that I wanted to be. To a student watching this now, you shouldn't feel the pressure, to make such a decision yourself. Usually, I mean, the vast majority of the time, um, uh, you're in no position really you're still taking all the incoming of your classes and of just what society has to offer you, and you should treat that as if you were a human sponge, and as you absorb all of this, decide, uh, what really, ignites your passions. And there's conflicting views about what I'm about to say, but this is my view of it. Um, it's it's now understood that it's a really uh, tumultuous time in the American workforce. And when I was a kid, you got out of school, you maybe, let's say, went to law school, you joined a law firm, you stayed at that law firm forever, or you worked for IBM or some other company. That kind of corporate loyalty uh, just doesn't exist anymore. And and while that can be disquieting and intimidating, it can also be viewed as an invitation. Since the world is maybe not going to treat you with that sort of loyalty, you should take that as an invitation to follow what's really of interest to you. And because it's a, it is in many ways an optimal time for risk taking, since in a lot of aspects, it's a greater risk to go with what seems safe at the moment, um, when, as it turns out, it may not prove to be so safe after all, and you've done it only to be safe. Better to uh, to really take a stab at something that you'll be motivated to do every day, and I do think that the motivation to um, to the drive to face each day with real zeal is one of the greatest assets a person can have.
That's all great advice. I really appreciate you talking with us. I want to thank you, Robert, for reminding us how powerful the journey from classroom to careers can be, and thank our audience for spending time with us. We want to encourage you to continue watching as we share more stories from the remarkable graduates of Spring Branch Independent School District, because every legacy begins somewhere. Thanks, Robert.
Thank you.
This has been From Classrooms to Careers, presented by the Spring Branch ISD Alumni Foundation, made possible by the generous support of First Community Credit Union.